Early that morning, Malaysia Airlines flight MH370 slipped out of the sky as if someone erased it mid-sentence. No distress call came through, no explosion was seen, and no wreckage surfaced. Yet hours later, MH370 was still talking quietly, not to air traffic control, but to an Inmarsat satellite system designed to keep time, not track planes. Investigators believed this signal would solve the case. Instead, it deepened it because the data drew wide arcs without a location, and years of searches found nothing. So what if the signal everyone trusted never told the whole story behind its disappearance forever? On March 8, 2014, Malaysia Airlines flight MH370 took off after midnight, and everything about the trip looked routine until the flight stopped behaving like a normal aircraft in a normal world. Roughly 40 minutes after departure, the jet went electronically dark. The transponder signal was gone, radio contact ended, and the familiar trail that keeps airliners visible to controllers simply dropped away, leaving only questions in the space where answers should be. But the aircraft did not vanish completely, because a satellite network kept receiving quiet handshakes long after radar contact ended. Then another piece of the puzzle appeared. Military radar data later suggested the plane turned back, crossed the Malay Peninsula, and tracked over the Malacca Strait, a move that did not match its planned route and did not fit the idea of a sudden accident. At first, many people assumed the story ended in the ocean. Search teams swept huge areas, governments coordinated, and families waited as months turned into years. The effort cost vast sums and used advanced tools, yet the results stayed the same. No confirmed main wreckage, no black boxes, and no official ending that closes the case. That is where independent investigators enter the picture, not chasing wild myths, but chasing the uncomfortable gaps. They keep returning to one stubborn question, because it sits at the center of every map in every timeline. Why does the data refuse to line up? And what did we miss in the signals everyone learned to ignore? The first clue in the MH370 mystery is not about where the plane went, but about the moment it chose to disappear. Just seconds after the final radio goodbye, the aircraft stopped responding to its transponder, and the ADS-B signal vanished from civilian tracking screens. Nothing in the captain's voice suggested danger, confusion, or stress, and no emergency code was transmitted. Air traffic controllers heard a calm, routine handoff, the kind spoken countless times every day without incident. Then, layer by layer, MH370 removed itself from the systems meant to keep it visible. This detail matters because modern commercial aircraft are not designed to fail silently. They are built with overlapping safeguards, warnings, and alerts that trigger when something goes wrong. A sudden loss of multiple tracking systems without alarms points away from malfunction and toward deliberate action. That conclusion becomes stronger when the sequence is examined closely. The systems shut down cleanly, one after the other, in a way that suggests intention rather than chaos. Commercial pilots do not randomly disable tracking equipment during flight. These systems exist to prevent collisions and manage crowded airspace, and turning them off creates immediate risk. Doing so places not only that aircraft in danger, but every other plane sharing the sky. The timing of the shutdown deepens the mystery even further. It occurred at a handoff point between two air traffic control regions. At that moment, responsibility shifts between countries, and any confusion can delay a coordinated response. Disappearing precisely then buys time before alarms are raised and questions begin. For years, this single act shaped how the world understood the case. If the systems were turned off from inside the cockpit, many assumed the answer was obvious. The pilot must have done it, and the story ended there. That assumption hardened over time, even as other pieces refused to align. What often goes unnoticed is how controlled the situation appeared in those final moments. A true emergency usually announces itself through urgency, noise, or frantic communication. MH370 offered none of that, which points toward planning rather than panic. Investigators also note that disabling both systems requires procedural knowledge, not instinct. It demands familiarity with aircraft operations and access from within the plane. This eliminated outside interference at that stage and narrowed the focus inward. Yet narrowing the focus too early can hide what comes next, because silence was not the end of MH370's story. Just 2 minutes after the aircraft vanished from secondary radar, a different system quietly came back online. This return was invisible to air traffic controllers and nearby aircraft. It left no voice, no position, and no heading. Instead, it sent a simple timing signal to a satellite. At first, this detail seemed insignificant because attention remained fixed on what had gone dark. Later, it would become the most debated evidence in the entire investigation. The signal suggested that while the aircraft chose silence, it never fully disappeared. That contradiction forced investigators to ask a harder question. If MH370 went dark on purpose, why allow any signal at all? The answer cannot be found in the cockpit switches alone. It lies in understanding which systems were switched down and which were left alive. That distinction changes the story from a simple act to a complex sequence, and it leads the investigation away from what vanished toward what quietly remained. To understand what switched back on, the search must follow the signal that refused to stay silent. Only then does the mystery move forward. The third clue is even stranger than the shutdown because it suggests MH370 didn't just go silent, it restarted a hidden voice. After the aircraft vanished from normal tracking, the satellite data unit came back online and began sending brief handshakes to an Inmarsat satellite. To most people, that sounds like a small technical detail, but inside a Boeing 777, it's a big deal. Because this box is not part of everyday flying. Pilots don't use it to navigate, they don't use it to talk to air traffic control, and many crews could fly their whole careers without ever needing to touch it. That matters because a reboot is not something that happens by accident in the background like a phone resetting in your pocket. In this case, the log data points to a power cycle, meaning the unit lost power and then started up again. For investigators, that simple fact carries weight because it tells them someone either cut power to the system or triggered a reset that most people would not even know exists. This was not forgetfulness, and it was not instinct because nothing about MH370 that night looked like a rushed emergency response. If a crew were fighting smoke, fire, or sudden failure, the cockpit would likely sound different and the aircraft would likely behave differently. Instead, the plane went dark in a clean sequence, and then this separate system woke up as if it had been commanded. Here is the key point for a general viewer. INSAT handshakes are not GPS pings. They are time checks that confirm a satellite terminal is alive, which is why investigators can use them to estimate distance arcs, but they do not get a simple dot on a map. That is why this reboot is so unsettling. It did not create clarity, it created a trail that looks precise yet never gives a final position. Now add the human factor. Experienced 777 pilots have said that rebooting the SDU is not a normal cockpit move. It is closer to maintenance knowledge, the kind tied to systems in the avionics bay and the network of computers under the floor. In 2014, most passengers assumed planes were protected like modern smartphones, but many systems were built before cyber threats were taken seriously, and security was not always the first design goal. So, if MH370's SDU rebooted, it hints at extreme action or access from elsewhere inside the aircraft, or both. That possibility widens the story beyond a single switch flip. It raises the idea that someone understood the plane at a deeper level than most people assume. And that matters because complex acts can look simple to outsiders. A magician wins by predicting what the audience will assume. If investigators assume the SDU was left on by mistake, the reboot challenges that comfort. It suggests the opposite, that the person behind this knew what to silence and what to allow. Even if the reboot were automatic, the timing is brutal. It starts after the plane is already missing, as if someone left fingerprints made of pure data behind us. And that leads to the twist that refuses to go away. If the SDU was never meant to reveal a route, why was it allowed to speak? And why at that moment? To answer that, the investigation has to move away from the cockpit narrative and into the hidden architecture of the aircraft. In the next chapter, the handshakes stop being background noise and become the map that everyone argues over. The Inmarsat record is the reason MH370 never truly vanished, because the aircraft left a trail that looks like math, not smoke. Once the satellite data unit was awake, it began sending brief handshakes to an Inmarsat satellite at regular intervals, usually about once an hour. These signals were never designed to tell the world where a plane is, yet they proved the aircraft was still powered and still flying long after it left radar. Each handshake carries timing information, and from that timing, investigators can estimate how far the plane was from the satellite. That creates distance rings, not a pin on a map, so every new handshake draws a wider arc of possible locations. Over time, those arcs formed a corridor that could point in two opposite directions. One route runs south, deep into the Indian Ocean, where open water stretches for thousands of miles and where a crash could hide on the seabed. The other route runs north across Asia, through remote airspace and towards Central Asia, where land, mountains, and geopolitics change the problem entirely. This is where the case becomes a battle over two numbers, BTO and BFO. BTO is short for burst timing offset, and it is basically a measure of distance because it captures how long the signal took to travel. Investigators treat it as the stronger anchor, since timing is hard to fake without changing the whole system. BFO is burst frequency offset, and it relates to how the signal frequency shifts, which can hint at direction and speed. In simple terms, BTO tells you the size of the circle, while BFO tries to suggest which way along that circle the plane was moving. But BFO is also the fragile part, because frequency can be influenced by aircraft motion, by system settings, and by any manipulation that changes what the unit thinks is happening. That fragility is not a loophole for fantasy. It's a reminder that the same data can be read two ways. If you assume the plane was on its original path, the numbers look odd. If you assume the plane was being managed by someone who understood its systems, the numbers look like breadcrumbs. This is why many people are locked onto the southern route. It felt like the cleanest story because it ends in water, and water swallows evidence. Search planners used the arcs to define broad zones, then narrowed them using models of speed, fuel, and drift. The world watched as ships and robots swept the seafloor because the map looked scientific and the conclusion felt close. Yet year after year, the searches came back empty, and the absence began to speak. A plane the size of a Boeing 777 should leave more than silence, especially after a billion-dollar effort. Some analysts point out that the arcs are symmetric in logic, and symmetry is dangerous because it lets the mind pick a favorite ending before the evidence earns it. So the question shifted from where the arc points to whether the arc was pointing us away. That's the twist Inmarsat forces on everyone. What if the southern interpretation became popular because it was safe, and what if the northern interpretation stayed quiet because it was uncomfortable? The handshakes do not prove a destination, but they do prove endurance, and endurance means intention. To decide between the two mirror paths, the story must test assumptions, not just plot lines. In the next chapter, the search itself becomes evidence, because what was not found may be as revealing as what was. The strongest argument for the southern route was simple. If MH370 ran out of fuel, the ocean would keep it secret. Governments acted on that logic at a scale that felt almost unreal, because this was not a private hunt, but a global response with public pressure behind it. Search teams mapped huge zones in the southern Indian Ocean and then began scanning the seabed mile after mile with tools built to see what human eyes never can. They used deep-water sonar, side-scan imaging, and autonomous underwater vehicles that could fly a planned grid just above the bottom, recording every ridge and shadow. On paper, it looked like the perfect plan, because the seafloor in many of those areas is relatively flat and open, not crowded with wrecks or noisy terrain. If a large aircraft hit the water and sank, its main pieces should have stood out, even after years. A Boeing 777 is not a small object, and its engines, landing gear, and dense structures do not dissolve into nothing. That is why the silence from the search results became its own kind of evidence. Year after year, crews reported the same outcome: clean scans, no fuselage, no engines, no flight recorders. The world kept hearing numbers about square miles covered and missions completed, yet the central fact stayed unchanged. Families watched a modern miracle of technology sweep the deep while the ocean gave nothing back. In some reports, the search covered tens of thousands of square miles, and the costs climbed into the billions when you combine ships, crews, analysis, and time. That investment matters because it sets an expectation of what should be detectable. This is where an uncomfortable question appears, because planes do not usually vanish on the seafloor without leaving a clear signature. Even when wreckage breaks apart, sonar can still detect debris fields, and investigators often find a trail that leads to the core. Air France Flight 447 was located in the Atlantic after a long search, and once the site was found, the pieces told a story, and the recorders filled in the rest. MH370 did not offer that moment, which is why the southern conclusions started to feel less like certainty and more like habit. Some people argue that the search area was still too wide, or that the plane could be in a trench, a steep slope, or a patch of rough ground that hides targets. Those are real possibilities, but they also reveal how much the theory depends on missing what should be visible. At some point, a search that finds nothing forces a pause for the first, not because it proves a new theory, but because it weakens the old one. If you scan a place that should contain the answer, and the answer is not there, you have to consider that you are asking the wrong place. That is the quiet twist hidden inside the failed search. The strongest map in the case led to a destination that refused to appear, and every empty scan made that refusal louder. So the question shifts again, away from where the plane sank and toward whether it sank there at all. If MH370 is not resting on the ocean floor in the zones we trusted, then either the data was misread, the final flight path was different, or the aircraft ended somewhere that no one has fully searched. That possibility does not solve the mystery, but it changes the direction of the hunt, and it opens the door to the other mirror route, the one that points north. The northern route sounds impossible until you ask a simpler question. What if MH370 did not need to be invisible, only unobserved? Night is the ally of any aircraft that wants to slip through gaps because many countries do not run their most expensive radar systems at full power after midnight. Primary radar costs money to operate. It needs electricity and trained staff, and in regions without a constant threat, some stations can be left idle for hours. That's why it was surprising that Malaysia had primary radar coverage at all, because it is not a nation on permanent alert. If MH370 turned back across the Malacca Strait, it could have aimed for a chain of weak points rather than a single blind spot. It would pass near the Andaman Islands, an Indian territory where officials said early on that an installation existed, but it was not turned on. Then the track would approach Kolkata, a major airport area where air defense units exist, and that is the place critics say the plane should have been seen. But seeing is not automatic, because detection depends on whether the right radar is active, whether anyone is watching closely, and whether the contact looks urgent enough to trigger action. If the plane then moves north toward the Himalayas, the geography itself becomes part of the cover. Mountains create radar shadows, so India could lose a low target on the far side of the range, and western China is vast, high, and difficult to monitor continuously. That region is often described as an aviation desert, a visible hole in global traffic maps, and the reason is not mystery, but physics. If a jet suffers cabin depressurization, standard procedure is to descend to about 10,000 feet so passengers can breathe. Yet much of that terrain is higher than that threshold. Airlines avoid those corridors because the emergency options are limited and special training and extra oxygen are required for the few routes that cross high plateau areas. So a large airliner moving through that space at night would not be blending into traffic, it would be traveling through emptiness. And emptiness can be safer than crowding if your goal is to avoid questions. Even military bases do not always run at full readiness, especially in remote high-altitude zones where crews rotate and equipment is not kept hot 24 hours a day. If a radar operator sees an unknown return, there may not be fighters ready to scramble, and admitting a gap in coverage is not something governments like to publicize. Air defense networks are sensitive by design because secrecy is part of the deterrent. This is why the North option isn't fantasy, it's a map of human habits, budgets, and silence. Avoiding detection does not require science fiction, it requires knowing when systems are off and when procedures move slowly. Which brings us to the larger twist. A Boeing 777 has a place that is not controlled by the cockpit in the way most viewers imagine. Beneath the cabin floor sits the avionics bay, a hatch like a small door, a space full of computers and wiring where maintenance work happens and where a person could hide briefly during cruise. If someone had access there, they could influence systems in ways that do not look like a pilot flipping switches. And if that's true, the North route is not only about geography, it's about access and about, well, planning a path through the moments when nobody is looking. The MH370 story refuses to settle because every simple answer leaves something behind. The cockpit theory explains key moments, such as the system shutdowns and the long flight, yet it also asks us to believe one person planned extraordinary complexity only to leave a trail that points directly at himself. That contradiction matters because real deception usually hides behind what looks obvious. As the data piles up, another possibility begins to take shape, one that feels colder and more deliberate, where systems were used, not broken, and silence was part of the design. In that version of events, the goal was not chaos, but control, not a dramatic end, but a disappearance clean enough to resist proof. The unanswered questions are no longer only about where the plane fell, but why the evidence keeps bending away from closure. 10 years later, satellites still speak, radar gaps still matter, and the ocean still gives no reply. MH370 may not be a failure of technology, but a lesson about how fragile certainty becomes when information is incomplete. So the mystery remains open, not because we lack data, but because the story may be larger than we expected. If deception works best when it feels obvious, then one question remains. What if MH370 was never meant to be found at all?